Hello, everyone, and welcome to Glasgow Loves EU lockdown live stream. And we're really delighted to welcome Hilary Benn joining us tonight, MP for Leeds Central. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Now, my name is Fiona Wishlade, and also with us on the call are Bernd Poor, who's making sure all of the tech works out for us and recording the session, and Jenny is monitoring social media. So if you have questions, if you want to put them up on Twitter and Facebook, and we'll try and get around to them. Okay, so obviously, you've had a long and varied career, both in government and in opposition, and we could ask you about loads of different things. But the focus of our group is on Brexit and the question of future European relations. Now, obviously, you chaired the so-called Brexit committees in three parliaments, and you've got a wealth of experience from that can maybe help us to understand, where we are now and what might come next. So, I mean, maybe I can start by asking you a bit about the role of the Brexit committees. Can you tell us a bit about, how the three successive committees operated?
Sure. Well, it was a very interesting experience. The point about parliamentary select committees is, on the whole, they operate by consensus, because that makes their reports have greater force if you can get people from different parties to sign up to a set of recommendations. The Brexit Select Committee was slightly different because, I must be honest with you, Brexit politics affected how the committee operated, because it was made up of people who voted to leave and people who voted to remain. Both felt very passionately about it. And as you will see from a number of the reports that we produced, we were not able to reach a consensus. Interestingly, the reports we produced on citizens' rights, we did, saying that European citizens must be enabled to remain here and to receive all their rights and stay and continue to contribute to our society, and ditto for Brits living in the other 27 EU countries. But on a number of really important reports, we disagreed, and we resolved that in time-honoured fashion by voting on various amendments. And if you're interested in the detail, you can go look at the reports, and if you go to the back, you can see what amendments were moved and whether they were carried or not, which will give you a sense of where the different members of the committee were coming from. I tried hard to achieve consensus. The longest time we ever took attempting to agree a report by consensus was 8 hours, which is, so we weren't exactly trying to, rush things through, but ultimately that wasn't possible. And so, for example, when we said, and it was an important recommendation, that we do not think that leaving the EU without an agreement, a so-called no-deal Brexit, is a policy that any responsible UK government could possibly follow, the committee divided on that. And I suppose if you look at Brexit politics as it applied in the House of Commons more generally, the great battles in particular between Mrs. May losing her majority in the 2017 election and Boris Johnson winning the election in 2019, when there was no majority for the government in Parliament, the great battles were to prevent a no-deal Brexit from happening. And we passed, excuse me, 2 pieces of legislation, subsequently named the Cooper Act and the Benn Act, because ours happened to be the names at the top of the bills, saying to the respective prime ministers, you cannot take us out without a deal, therefore you must apply for more time. Now, I don't think in the end Mrs. May would have taken us out with no deal. I can't say I'm wholly confident that the same is true of the current Prime Minister, but even he in the end, I think, realised that to impose the economic consequences of a no deal on the British economy, particularly as we are facing the worst economic crisis in 300 years because of coronavirus, would have been pretty difficult to explain. And I suppose ultimately we did win that battle because an agreement was reached. I always thought there would be a deal, thin though it is, because it was not in the interests of either side, given the huge amount of trade that flows between us, to go back to imposing tariffs on each other, which would have been really damaging in the UK instance for farmers, beef and lamb farmers, the motor industry, aerospace, and other very, very important sectors.
Yep.
I hope the reports speak for themselves. And obviously we took evidence and we learnt a lot in asking people, including ministers, a lot of questions.
Yeah, I mean, there's a wealth of information in the reports, and the expert witnesses that you had. I mean, provide so many insights as well. Sometimes more than the ministers, one might say. But that's another thing. Now, the committee was wound up in the middle of last month when the standing order expired. And I mean, Michael Gove is on record today in the European Scrutiny Committee as saying that it's for Parliament to decide on the scrutiny arrangements. And yet, Jacob Rees-Mogg seemed to have been in the driving seat over ending the Future Relations Committee. What can you clarify what happened there, or why the government seems to be able to end the lifetime of the committee?
In a nutshell, because for select committees to be established or wound up or membership changed, the government has to put a motion on the order paper. So we have the theory that Parliament is in control, but government in the main has control of the business that's discussed. That's why. And that is why when we passed our two bills, to force the prime ministers to ask for more time to avoid a no-deal Brexit, we had to, as people described it, seize control of the order paper. And I hated that phrase, because parliamentarians legislating, I'm sorry, I thought that's what we were sent there to do. There's nothing sort of improper or unconstitutional about this. Indeed, on sitting Fridays, when private members' bills are being taken, that's exactly what Parliament does. And in effect, our two bills were private members' bills taken on a different day of the week other than a Friday. The government, after the election of 2019, the government said, well, we'll re-establish a committee for a year. I think there's been a feeling on the part of many in the government, we want to sort of abolish the word Brexit and move on. I suspect they thought, well, if a deal is reached in October, that will give a couple of months or so, 2.5 months for the committee to examine it, and then we can move on to something else. But of course, we know now that the deal wasn't concluded until Christmas Eve. So I wrote to Michael Gove in December and said, look, there isn't a deal yet. There may be a deal, there may not be a deal, but we're going to need time to scrutinise the consequences. Can you extend our life for a few months? I'm sorry, we wrote to Jacob Rees-Mogg, I apologise. And Jacob Rees-Mogg wrote back and said, no, Parliament has lots of other means for scrutinising relationship with Europe. I wrote to him again on the 7th, I think it was, of January, to say, further to my previous letter, we've now discovered that we won't be able, before we are abolished, even to take evidence from the man who negotiated the deal on behalf of the United Kingdom, Lord Frost, because he couldn't make our last week in existence because he was away. And I think it's a bit hard to say we've completed the job that Parliament gave us if we can't even take evidence, because we had lots of questions to put to him about the deal that he negotiated on behalf of the country. And Jacob Rees-Mogg wrote back and said, no. Now, you might say the government wasn't terribly keen that the committee should carry on scrutinising what's going on. There is still another committee with Europe in the title, which is Bill Cash's European Scrutiny Committee. Now, its function over the years has been to identify forthcoming legislation which has implications for the United Kingdom. This is European legislation. But of course, we've now left, the transition period's over. So the government could give the European Scrutiny Committee a new remit, or it could get rid of it, or, well, who knows? What we did say in our very final report as the Select Committee was that we were clearly of the view that there will be a continued need for scrutiny, both of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and the withdrawal agreement that was signed a year previously, which includes the Northern Ireland Protocol, covers citizens' rights. And as we've seen in the first month and a few days since the end of the transition period, well, boy, are there a lot of issues that are arising because of our new relationship. And I would just make this point about the trade and cooperation agreement that was reached. It was thin because the government, in many senses, asked for very little, because they wanted to avoid the European side saying, well, if you're going to do that, you've got to come within the rules of the single market or the customs union or the purview of the European Court of Justice. And the government decided bluntly to put sovereignty above the economic interests of the country. That's what we all have to understand they did. And Brexit is a story of politics and sovereignty triumphing over economic common sense, I would describe it as. And the point I'd make about sovereignty is this: I can make all three of you sovereign if I just lock the door of the room you're in and walk away with the key, because you'll be sovereign in your room that you're speaking to me from. No one can tell you what to do. You will be king or queen in your own domain. But where's it going to get you? And the answer is it's not going to get you anywhere. And the truth about states in this day and age is we pool sovereignty, we take on obligation in return for benefits. And if you think of the great challenges that we face in the world, be it tackling dangerous climate change or economic relationships or trade or threats to peace and security, people fleeing the land of their birth because of war and conflict, we're only going to deal with this if we work with others. And therefore, I find it very strange that sovereignty has been elevated in this way because the economic benefits, well, clearly do not exist. The one thing that the TCA did was to make the economic damage of Brexit a bit less bad than it would have otherwise been. It's really important to understand that. And the reason why I voted for the deal is a number of other people abstained, but all those who abstained would have voted for it if their vote had made the difference as to whether it passed or not, because none of them wanted no deal. So in effect, those who voted for it were doing the heavy lifting on behalf of those who said, I'm abstaining because I don't want to dip my hands in this, even though on the quiet, of course I want it to pass, because I don't want a no deal Brexit, because we'd all been working together to defeat that. And many of the consequences we're now seeing are the result not of the deal, but of Brexit itself. And the vote on the 30th of December was never going to stop Brexit, because Brexit was just about to happen. So anyway, that's the sort of long and short of where we are. I hope very much that Parliament will find a way of continuing that scrutiny, because so many issues are now coming up. Whether I was on a Zoom call first thing this morning with musicians and artists and performers and technicians talking about the nightmare that has now been created for them to carry on touring. One musician said, you know, my way of life has just been stolen from me because it doesn't work for the kind of touring and performing that I do. Or you look at the shellfish controversy today, or you look at the fashion industry that's expressed concern. You look at what's happening in Northern Ireland because of the Northern Ireland Protocol. More and more things are coming out of the woodwork as this very, very complicated agreement, which we had as a committee, in effect, if you ignore Christmas, we had a couple of days to scrutinise, become apparent. And more of this will come out over the weeks and the months ahead.
I mean, am I right in thinking then from what you said that it's essentially for the government to table something on the scrutiny of the implementation of things, and unless and until it does so, then it depends on things coming up in the European Scrutiny Committee or I don't know, possibly international trade. I don't know if it would come up.
And also departmental select committees, because DCMS, for example, Culture, Media and Sport, has already been looking at the impact of the new rules, the cost, the visas, the carnets for equipment, and all of that is imposing on a fantastically successful British industry, which is music, the performing arts. It's one of our great exports. And we've just made the life of those people much, much more difficult because of wretched Brexit.
Mm.
The Prime Minister talks about wanting to get rid of red tape. He's just emptied a bucket load, indeed a wheelbarrow load, of red tape, cost and bureaucracy on many sectors of the British economy, and firms are struggling.
Okay, before we move on to talk a bit more about the deal, is there any questions about the committee side of things from social media, Jenny?
There aren't any questions specifically about the committee just yet.
Okay, well, we'll maybe move on to talk a bit about the substance of the deal, the trade and cooperation agreement. And you mentioned, that the committee put together a report very rapidly, in fact, between Christmas Eve and New Year, and picking up on the complexity of some of the issues. And I mean, one imagines that to some extent some things have been concealed by the pandemic. But we've already seen, things coming up in relation to fish, to cheese, to fashion, to shellfish, musicians, and so on. I mean, just based on your experience in and the evidence that you heard in the select committee, have you been surprised at what's happened, or is this just project reality?
Well, you use the phrase project reality, of course. When we warned of a number of these things, we were, of course, accused of being the people behind Project Fear. And when I saw that video the other day of a fisherman from the southwest who just was ruining the vote that he had cast because he'd believed that getting back control of our fish, whatever our fish are, would make his life better, and he's actually found it's made it considerably worse. So I think we've always known that there would be cost, there would be bureaucracy, there would be paperwork, and one has to remember that for lots and lots of businesses that only trade with Europe, they haven't had to do any of this. And then suddenly someone says, right, you've got to fill in a 17-page form and you've got to pay for an export health certificate. And that's a cost. The supermarkets have managed to ward off for 3 months having to produce an export health certificate for all of the food items in the back of their lorry that is supplying a supermarket in Belfast or Londonderry. And what Michael Gove is currently discussing with Maroš Šefčovič is, can we extend that grace period? Because that is a big cost. And for some businesses, the cost may reach a point where it's greater than the margin they are making on their business. That's the first point. And the second point is a whole way of doing things has grown up because it has been as easy to move goods and supplies from Paris to London or Athens to London as it has been to move goods from London to Glasgow or Leeds to Edinburgh. And therefore, I think what we're going to see in the medium term, unless some of these things can be sorted out, is we will see changes in the way in which supply chains operate, because people will either decide, I can't do this anymore. I was talking to someone the other day who said, I'm a keen cyclist. I used to buy my stuff from a firm in the Netherlands. They've stopped supplying the United Kingdom market. So it's working both ways. Now, the government says, this is teething troubles. Or the government says the EU is just being incredibly obstructive and difficult. Whereas the truth is, we have made ourselves a third country. And you know what? The EU is applying the rules to the United Kingdom. Now we're a third country in exactly the same way as it applies the rules to other third countries. And so a lot of this is inevitable, I'm sorry to say. And it pains me to make that point. Now, in a couple of cases, the Northern Ireland Protocol, there is a mechanism because the issue which leads to checks in the Irish Sea, and we know the history of this, the moment you said we're leaving the single market and the customs union, which Theresa May announced, you had a big problem in Ireland because everyone agreed in the negotiations, every single person, you cannot put a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. So how do you make sure that goods moving from the United Kingdom through Northern Ireland into the EU comply with the rules of the single market and the customs union? Well, you have to have a border somewhere else, or the UK has to decide to continue following those rules. And originally, Mrs. May proposed an all UK solution. It was voted down. Boris Johnson, before he was Prime Minister, said no Conservative Prime Minister will ever agree to a border in the Irish Sea. The moment he was elected, he promptly agreed to a border in the Irish Sea through the Northern Ireland Protocol. However, what that said was, we need to identify which goods are at risk of entering the European Union. And the EU approach to the talks was everything's at risk unless we can identify that it isn't. And the UK side was to say nothing is at risk unless we can identify that it is. And they have to meet somewhere in the middle. Now, I would argue that lorry load of goods heading for the Asda or the Sainsbury in Belfast, I struggle to see how those goods present a risk to the integrity of the single market, because the furthest they're going to go is maybe in the boot of a car to a house in Donegal of someone who's gone shopping in Londonderry, whereupon they'll go into the fridge or freezer and be consumed. So I do think a pragmatic approach could be taken by the EU. And remember that the one difference between Northern Ireland and the UK as a whole is Northern Ireland is still part of the United Kingdom. It's still part of the customs territory, and therefore an element of common sense and flexibility, particularly in view of the sensitivity of these matters in Northern Ireland. We've seen the reported threats to staff who are doing the checks. I really hope that that joint committee is going to reach a sensible arrangement. On the musicians, the EU says we offered the UK something in the negotiations, the EU turned it down. The UK says we made an offer, the EU turned it down. We haven't quite got to the bottom of that. The one good thing, well, not good thing, the one glimmer of hope is that the agreement, the TCA, Trade and Cooperation Agreement, specifically envisages that there will be room for further negotiations and new agreements to be signed. And therefore, my argument would be this, that the Brexit issue is over, we've left. The question from the 1st of January is a new one. What kind of relationship do we wish to have with our closest neighbours, our biggest trading partners, and our friends on the other side of the channel? And if someone comes along and says, why don't we make it easier for our musicians to go there and their musicians to come here, I'd find it very hard to believe that Nigel Farage could say Brexit has been betrayed, because most people would say, well, that sounds very sensible to me. So we now need to get behind the people who are arguing that we should go to the EU and say, can we reach an agreement here? How the EU will respond, well, that's another matter entirely, but we have to persuade the government to make the approach in the first place.
And I mean, obviously, one of the big differences between Theresa May's withdrawal agreement and Boris Johnson's was the treatment of Northern Ireland in that. I mean, obviously, there was like an ill-judged comment or proposal from the EU over Article 16 and the vaccines, which has been sort of milked fairly heavily. But I mean, how realistic is it to find a resolution to the problems in Northern Ireland in fairly swift order?
I think it's extremely important because it's politically very sensitive. I mean, some people are stoking it up, and some people are saying the Northern Ireland Protocol has to disappear now; it has to be rescinded, and then you're back into the proposed clauses that the government moved to the internal market bill, which led to a huge rumpus because the UK announced. I was in the chamber when Minister said, yes, what we're proposing would breach international law in limited and something else respects, he said, as if that was okay. Your Honour, yes, I did commit the crime, but it was in a limited and temporary way. And the EU was apoplectic about that, quite reasonably, because the UK was calmly announcing it was proposing to set aside an international agreement it had negotiated, the Prime Minister had signed, about 9 months after that event. And then conversely, as you've rightly pointed out, I don't know what got into the Commission that evening, it was a spectacularly ill-judged move, and they realised very quickly when Michael Martin and Boris Johnson rang up and said, "What on earth are you doing?" And they went, "Oh, crumbs, yes, okay, right, we didn't mean to do that, we'll rescind it." And it meant the EU was leading with its chin, and the government has piled in on the back of that to say, well, that was all very bad. Now, can we sort out all of these problems? And of course, under the Northern Ireland Protocol, the Northern Ireland Assembly has an opportunity to vote whether to continue with it or not. Now, the side of the Northern Ireland Protocol which is not much discussed is actually the beneficial position it puts Northern Ireland in, because it has access to both markets.
Yep.
And if you were thinking of investing in a part of the United Kingdom to be able to have confidence about future trade with the EU, you might think, well, Northern Ireland is the place that I'd put it. So the fact that the EU did agree to 2 grace periods for export health certificates and for the famous sausages and chilled meat shows it can be done. And if it can be done for 3 months and 6 months respectively, can't it be done for a year or 2 years? And that, I've no doubt, we know, is what Michael Gove is putting to Mr. Šefčovič as we speak. And then the EU has an opportunity to see, well, do we have to continue to worry about goods being at risk of entering the market and undermining the integrity of the single market and the customs union? Because that's what the issue is. And I suppose their fear is at some point, if the system doesn't work, and an item of food with an authorized level of pesticides on it makes its way into a shop in Paris, and someone goes to the European Court of Justice, the European Court of Justice might well say to the Irish government, "I'm terribly sorry, but you've left the back door open. Would you now shut it?" But you can't shut it on the border, because no one, and I mean no one, will put checks on the border.
Yeah.
And nor should they.
Okay. Great. Okay, Jenny, I think you've got some questions about the deal before we move on to the next topic.
Yeah. So we've had a question in from Twitter asking, so looking back, do you think that more could have been done to prevent Brexit being framed as the will of the people, so-called?
Well, the fact is, we lost. Those of us who argued passionately to remain, we lost. We lost the referendum. And I know people argued at the time, it's not legally binding and so on and so forth. That isn't the point. That is not the point. Politically, it was binding. We lost, and all of our troubles that we're discussing stem from the moment when we lost by 52 to 48. Now, the polls indicate that the British public, on reflection, more of them think it was not a very good idea, as opposed to those who think it was still a good idea. But we lost in the same way those who argued to leave the common market in 1975 lost. The margin was slightly, well, it was bigger, it was 2/3 to 1/3. I think the real problem looking back at the referendum was it answered one question, do you want to be in or out of the institution? But it didn't answer the subsequent question, okay, so what kind of relationship do you want to have with the body that you're leaving? And it's a bit like a divorce. You can range from, you sit down, you talk over who's going to get the kids, where they're going to live, how you split up the furniture and the possessions and the CD collection, and are civil to each other and continue to have a different relationship over the years ahead in the interests of the children, on the one hand, and a divorce in which one party walks out of the house, slams the door, screaming, "I never want to see you again." And in between, there's a range of outcomes. And I think looking back on it, and that was one of the arguments, of course, for the confirmatory referendum, which I must confess I came to later on, than others, because I thought that we had an obligation to seek to give effect to the referendum result. It's why I voted to trigger Article 50. And I know there was criticism from some passionate pro-Europeans at the time, said you don't have to do this. The trouble is, if you didn't vote to trigger Article 50, you were in effect saying to 52% of those who voted, doesn't matter what you voted, I know better than you, now get lost. And I'm afraid that was neither democratic nor politically a very wise thing to do. And if you're going to do something like this, well, not in future, after all, you put an offer in on a house, but you're not absolutely committed to it until you exchange contracts. And in between, you have a survey done. And the survey comes back and says, it's a bit dodgy, the roof's leaking, there's dry rot, it'll cost you an arm and a leg to fix it. Do you want to go ahead with this? And people say, perhaps not in these circumstances. And my argument always with those in favour of Brexit, who were so angry at us for arguing for a confirmatory referendum, because they were saying with real passion, you are disrespecting my vote. You're telling me I didn't know what I was doing, that it shouldn't count. And my response was to say, no, I'm not. Because if you want to carry on and leave on the basis of the deal that's been negotiated, you're perfectly free to do so. And if 52% vote to do that, what's to worry? But if actually the public have changed their minds, then a second question is raised. Do the public have the right to change their minds about a decision as big as this? And I believe passionately that they do. And that's where the battle lines were drawn. But in the end, it did not prove possible to get that confirmatory referendum. And I still, to this day, can't tell you what the result would have been. Because I think those who voted for Brexit would have been so cross that have come out in very large numbers to say, I told you once, now I'm going to tell you again.
Yep. Okay, I mean, staying with the political side of things, where our grouping isn't party political. There are people from across the spectrum. Now, obviously, we're in the middle of a pandemic still, and that's sort of like focused political attention on that crisis. But a lot of people, whatever their political affiliations, feel that Labour Party's been pretty quiet on European issues and hasn't really been holding the government to account as much as it might have done. And in Scotland, where we have elections to Holyrood in May, it does feel like Labour has ceded the ground of pro-EU progressive politics to the SNP. How do you react to that? Has Labour sort of gone missing in action?
No, I disagree with that. What happened in the House of Commons today? There was a statement on what's happening on shellfish. Last week there was an urgent question that Louise Haigh, the Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, had on what's happening in the Irish Sea. You've seen what Rachel Reeves has said. I think the Labour front bench is holding the government to account. Now, I know there's another issue, which is those who think Labour should be standing up and saying our policy is to rejoin the EU as fast as possible. But you've seen what Keir Starmer said. He said that's not going to be part of the election in 2024. You've seen what Ed Davey has said on behalf of the Liberal Democrats. Same thing. Why? Because quite a lot of the people who voted Remain, if you judge by the polls, said, I just want this over now. Can we please have a deal? Which eventually was reached. And I think the question for the moment is the one that I posed earlier. We've now left. What's the future relationship going to be? Now, who knows where things may be 10, 15, 20 years' time? Who knows what the European Union is going to look like in 10, 15, 20 years' time? But, in life as well as in politics, timing is everything. And I know of course, there's a particular reason why the SNP would wish to say that Labour is missing in action, but that's to do with Scottish independence rather than to do with Brexit, because there are people all over the United Kingdom who were taken out of the European Union against their will. And I'm looking at 4 of them now on this screen. And all of the people who are watching this live stream, I suppose, although there may be some people watching who voted to leave.
Okay. Jenny, I think you've got some questions that maybe follow on from that.
Well, we've got a few questions in. There's one or two asking whether you'll be campaigning to rejoin the EU. And then it's kind of two-pronged question. The other one is whether the UK will kind of creep back in through the back door back into the EU.
Right. Well, I think not for the moment is the answer to the first question, for the reasons I just set out in answering the last one. But we have a problem. Now, getting an agreement on musicians and shellfish and so on would be good. But there are those who say, well, all right, you can't campaign to rejoin the EU, because would that require another referendum? Well, I would say, yes, it would. Because we didn't have one in 73 when we joined the common market. I think we should have had one. When Labour was elected in 74, Harold Wilson said, I'll renegotiate and put it to the people, which was a way of dealing with the divisions in the Labour Party at the time, because the Labour Party then, as some of you will remember, was 2/3 against staying in the common market and 1/3 in favour. And the Tories were 100% pro-European. And in the intervening 45 years, the two parties crossed each other, moving in the opposite direction. The Tories now bitterly divided, Labour an overwhelmingly pro-European party, and that was reflected in the referendum campaign. People say, well, you should rejoin the customs union. I voted countless times to stay in the customs union, the single market and lots of other things. But you do then have to confront the democratic question, which is, so you're arguing that we join a set of rules and a legal framework over which we have absolutely no say whatsoever. And I put the point in answering the question from Twitter, because it'll be put by those who are not happy about that. Now, I know the ultimate answer is to say, well, rejoin it, and then you get to have a say. But it is a bit of a problem, because you are denying yourself a voice in the shaping of the rules. Now, we look carefully at the Select Committee in the way in which things work for Norway and Switzerland and others. And it was a slightly more complicated picture. Indeed, it was a very much more complicated picture than some people imply. And the reason I said a moment ago, it depends what the EU looks like, is this. We all know that the forces that gave rise to the referendum result in Britain are present in a number of other European countries. This is not a British phenomenon at all. And I would argue this: there are two great big political forces and two great political questions that are present in our world at the moment. And one force is the desire for greater control, self-determination, independence on the one hand, because I have a lot of constituents. Leeds Central is not a seat where we have the highest turnout in elections, because a lot of my constituents are not at all persuaded that politics has anything to do with improving their lives. And it's not surprising that the highest turnouts are to be found in the leafiest, most prosperous constituencies, because people have different perceptions and experience of their stake. But lots of people who'd never voted in an election before came out to vote in the referendum. And do you know why? Because if you'd asked them, do you think you have control over what's happened to your life, the way things have changed, the old manufacturing jobs have disappeared in your area, it's warehouse jobs, it's zero-hours contracts jobs, it's having to work 2 jobs to raise a family. A lot of them would have said, I don't have any control at all. And when someone comes along and says, would you like a bit more control? Would you like to take back control? Do not be surprised if a lot of people jump at the chance. So that's the one force. And on the other hand is the absolute necessity for international cooperation to deal with the great challenges of our age: climate change, threats to peace and security, trade, all of these things, because we cannot deal with them on our own. And what it seems to me the referendum result was about was the balance between the two. And in effect, 52% were saying we don't think the balance is quite right, and the only way to remedy it is to leave the EU. Whereas I think the EU might, in due course, want to reflect on this. Now, of course, it had to demonstrate that leaving leaves you with a pretty bad outcome. And we're now experiencing that in the United Kingdom, because we couldn't get a wonderful deal, because the EU would be afraid that other countries might say, well, I'm off, I'll have one of those British deals. Thank you very much indeed. So, and I am very much in favour of a European Union in the future that consists of the concentric circles that Emmanuel Macron spoke about in his Sorbonne lecture, where countries choose to become part of the European arrangement to the extent that they feel comfortable with it. And that is in opposition to the ever closer, faster, deeper union view, which is held, I know, passionately by some people, but that is not, I think, where a majority of the member states are. And it seems to me that would be the best way for the EU to continue to prosper as an entity, which I very much want it to do in the months and the years ahead. And the free movement, which in my view was probably what tipped the balance, if we actually did have control on how many citizens came from the EU, I don't suppose the numbers would be much different from what they turned out to be, for the simple reason is we have an economic need. Mm-hmm. And when people say, my final point on this, because it goes to the heart of the question, when people say, but free movement is a indivisible together with the other three freedoms, I'd put the question back like this. Okay, I hear you say that. If Turkey became a fully functioning democracy tomorrow, and Turkey applied to join the European Union, which it has, would the EU vote to admit Turkey on the basis of free movement of workers from Turkey? Well, I leave everyone on the call to answer the question for themselves, but I know what my answer is. No, it wouldn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, if it wouldn't, then just explain again why free movement is part of the arrangement that cannot be taken away. And if you look at the Ukraine Association Agreement, you see it reflected in that, where the EU agreed quite a few things with Ukraine, but as part of an association agreement, but a greater freedom of movement was not one.
Okay, Jenny, I think we've got time for one more question from social media before we wrap up with the last question.
Yeah, so we've had kind of a legalistic question in.
Okay.
Do you think that because the Brexit referendum was advisory and not legally binding, means that Scotland can do the same? And because a precedent has been set by the UK Supreme Court and cannot prevent Scotland from becoming independent?
Well, I think I would argue that there are two separate things. The fact is, the UK Parliament passed legislation to hold the referendum on membership of the European Union. And yes, it is true legally, I'm not a lawyer, that it wasn't legally binding, but everyone knew what they were doing. And it was politically binding, and I've answered the question earlier. I think it's clear that the holding of a referendum requires the consent of the UK Parliament in Scotland, because after all, that's what happened in 2014. Now, what the Supreme Court would do if the SNP decide to hold a referendum without getting the consent of the UK Parliament, how that referendum would actually go, would other parties boycotted it because it wasn't legally constituted? And I'm struck by the fact that Nicola Sturgeon has repeatedly said, we're going to do this the proper way. We're not going to do it another way. Now, I know there are views in the SNP who profoundly disagree with that and would like to follow the example of Catalonia. But yeah, I should lay my cards on the table. I am very much opposed to Scottish independence. I'm a quarter Scot, and I think when I look at Scotland from the vantage point of my constituents, it seems to me Scotland has a huge amount of power, but it also has the benefits that come from being part of the United Kingdom, as the vaccination programme demonstrates, which is a UK effort to save the lives of our citizens. And so we'll have to see what the future holds. We'll have to see.
Okay, well, just to sort of like finish up. I mean, obviously, we've been going through the pandemic, but even apart from that, a lot of aspects of British public life have seemed, quite fragile of late. We've had the fallout from the, things that we discovered through the Russia report that we discussed with Dominic Grieve on one of these chats. We've had, the prorogation of Parliament, and we've had the various procurement decisions. We've had the threat to break international law in a limited and specific way. I think it was. That
was it. You've got a very good memory.
It's not the kind of thing that you forget, really. So, I mean, how. It does seem a very unsettling time. How do we address those kind of threats? And are there grounds for optimism looking forward?
Right. Well, there always are grounds for optimism, because I don't know about you, but that's how I get up in the morning, because I believe that we can change things for the better. That's why I do the job that I do. Now, that's not. We also have to be realistic about the challenges that we're facing. Two things. The first is that the prorogation was a really good example of the consequences of our unwritten constitution as a country. And during that period when the government didn't have a majority, you could see how the norms, the traditions, the way of doing things, the unwritten understandings could be ripped apart by someone who was determined to do so. Now, we were appalled at the 5-week prorogation decision. We all know why the Prime Minister did this. He didn't have a majority in Parliament. He didn't want a Parliament doing things he didn't want us to do. So to send the elected representatives away because they're causing government a nuisance is not, in my view, a legitimate grounds for doing so. And that, in a nutshell, is what the Supreme Court ruled. I was sitting in a cafe at the Labour Party conference in Brighton, listening on my phone to Lady Hale deliver that absolutely extraordinary judgment. Now, because I wasn't convinced that the Supreme Court would want to go there. You might say, well, it's a matter for Parliament, because you go back to the Bill of Rights, 1689, I think, which basically agreed Parliament doesn't interfere in the courts and the courts don't interfere in Parliament. That's sort of part of the constitutional fabric. But it was so transparent that the Supreme Court decided you can have one for a week, because that's what normally you do in a prorogation. You're not having one for 5 weeks. Bang. And it was a very, very important moment. That's the first point. The second point, if you look across the Atlantic, to events that have now mercifully come to an end in the United States of America, and look at what Donald Trump did, you see another example of that kind of behavior. And then the other thing I would point to is the problems that are created for democracy when we don't share an agreement on who won an election, United States of America, and what the facts are. Now, we're going through a pandemic, and like all MPs, our workload has gone up enormously as people seek the help of their member of Parliament because of the difficulties that they're facing. But you get emails from people who say, coronavirus is made up, the PCR test is a fake, the hospitals are empty, blah, 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 blah. And you do sometimes just despair at where people get this from. And we know where people get this from. It is an alternative reality that tells them that this is the truth. last week I watched, because my son recommended it to me, I think it's called The Social Dimension. It's available on Netflix. I'm not on a retainer, but it was a really, really interesting film about the impact that social media has had, mainly interviewing people who've worked for Facebook, Twitter, Google, and the lot. And I think this is a real problem for our society, because as we'll have seen from the reporting in the United States of America, when people say, no, the election has been stolen, when there is no evidence for that, every court that considered any application chucked it out. And apart from anything else, what a monstrous thing to say about dedicated public servants who did what their job required of them to do, which was to count the votes in a fair and transparent manner. But it makes politics hard, because it creates this terrible division. And Brexit, as we know, created this terrible division in our country. And it was an incredibly unhappy and difficult experience, because it was about a lot of other things. And I think for, as I mentioned earlier, for my constituents who don't feel that they have gained from globalization, who don't feel they have gained from the overall economic benefit we've seen as a country from membership of the European Union is self-evident. But you talk to people who've seen no benefit at all, don't be surprised if they're really quite skeptical that it hasn't been good for them. And we need to find a way of responding to the concerns that people have. We are a monstrously economically divided country, Britain. We are the 6th richest country in the world. And last year, 1 million people went up to a stranger and said, I know you've never met me, but could you give me some food, because I can't feed my family this weekend. There is something fundamentally wrong with our society and our politics when that is the case. And those are the things that we have got to focus on as elected representatives and communities and those who care about the future of the world. But no, I am an optimist, because the history of human development is one of progress. And the reason why we praise the NHS is because politics was able to create it out of a world where if you didn't have the money, you couldn't go to the doctor. And if you didn't have the money, you certainly wouldn't be getting a vaccination at the moment. And if we can do that in the past, in very difficult circumstances, you know, the end of the Second World War, the debt was bigger, the economic crisis was enormous, and we had a government that legislated for real progressive social change. And I'm sure the same can happen again. So that's what keeps me going. And although it may seem pretty dark and awful at the moment, we just have to keep our eye on the light that is in the distance.
That's a great note to end on. Hilary Benn, it's been great to have you on our lockdown live stream. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and I hope you're all keeping safe and well.
Thank you.
All the best.